The trader's hand froze halfway to the pelt. His eyes went from the silver-gray wolf fur spread across the table to Pierre Dubois' weathered face, then back to the fur. Around them, the St. Louis fur market roared with its usual chaos. Buyers shouting prices, trappers haggling, the sharp smell of raw pelts mixing with tobacco smoke and river mud. But in the small circle around Pierre's table, silence had fallen like a hammer. "That's Wolf?" The trader's voice carried disbelief. He was Marcus Brennan, 20 years in the fur business, and he'd seen 10,000 wolf pelts pass through this market. None of them looked like this. Pierre nodded once. He'd learned early in his trapping career that letting the work speak saved breath better spent elsewhere. Brennan lifted the pelt carefully, holding it to the morning light streaming through the warehouse's high windows. The guard hairs caught the sun and threw it back in waves of silver and black. No breaks in the fur, no bare patches where hide showed through, no stiffness in the leather that would crack when folded. The pelt moved in his hands like water, supple and perfect, as if the wolf had just shrugged out of it an hour ago instead of 6 months back in the Montana Territory. "How?" Brennan's voice dropped to something almost reverent. "How in God's name did you preserve the guard hairs?" That's when the other trappers pressed closer. Pierre felt them before he saw them, the shift in air pressure, the weight of attention from men who'd spent the winter breaking their backs in country that wanted them dead, only to watch their hard-won pelts sell for a fraction of what they'd hoped. Men whose wives counted every coin. Men whose children wore patched clothes and ate thin soup. Men who needed every advantage they could get in a trade that was already slipping away as fashion turned from fur to silk and the beaver ponds ran empty. James Coulter pushed to the front. He was a big man, barrel-chested, with hands scarred from decades of setting traps in water so cold it could steal feeling from your fingers in under a minute. His wolf pelts were spread on the table next to his, and the difference was brutal. Where Pierre's fur gleamed, Coulter's looked dull. Where Pierre's guard hairs lay smooth and perfect, Coulter's were broken and matted. Coulter had killed 5 wolves that winter. Good kills, clean shots. But somewhere between the mountain and this market, the quality had died with them. "What's your secret, Dubois?" Coulter's voice carried an edge that made Pierre's hand drift closer to the knife on his belt. Not threat, not yet, but desperation. Coulter had a family, 3 children, and his pelts were worth maybe a fifth of what Pierre's would fetch. That kind of gap could mean the difference between making it through another year or giving up and heading back east to work in a factory. Brennan set the pelt down gently, like he was afraid it might shatter despite its obvious durability. "I'll give you $3 per pelt." The warehouse went dead quiet. $3 for wolf was unheard of. Top-quality beaver had fetched that once before the market collapsed. But wolf? Wolf was the fur you took when there was nothing else to take, and even then you were lucky to get 50 cents. Pierre had brought in 23 wolf pelts, 23 perfect silver-gray prizes that represented a winter of work so precise, so careful, so technically demanding that his fingers still ached from it. At $3 each, that was $69, more than most trappers made in a year. Enough to buy supplies for another season, pay off debts, maybe even purchase the small cabin plot he'd been eyeing near the confluence. "Each?" Pierre's voice stayed level, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He'd hoped for $2, Maybe, if Brennan was in a generous mood and the market was thin. Each. Brennan's eyes never left the pelts, and I want first right of refusal on next year's catch. Whatever wolves you bring in, I get first look. Around them, the other trappers stirred. The sound of it was like wind through dead leaves. The rustle of men realizing that something had fundamentally shifted in the economics of their trade. Someone had figured out how to turn wolves from a marginal living into real money. And that someone was a quiet French-Canadian who'd come out of the mountains with knowledge that none of them possessed. This is exactly what we explore here at Old West Archives. The moments when superior technique meant the difference between prosperity and poverty on the American frontier. If stories of innovation and survival captivate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the skills that separated success from failure in the fur trade. And tell us in the comments, what frontier skill do you wish you could master? Now let's get back to Pierre and his incredible techniques that changed the entire fur trade. Now, to understand how Pierre Dubois revolutionized wolf trapping in a dying fur trade, and why his technique spread through the mountains like wildfire, we need to understand just how brutal and unforgiving the economics of pelts had become by 1841. But more than that, we need to understand what it actually took to trap a wolf. Because these weren't deer standing in meadows waiting to be shot. Wolves were intelligent, suspicious, and absolutely deadly when cornered. The American fur trade was dying, though most trappers refused to admit it. The beaver that had driven the mountain man era through the 1820s and 1830s were gone, trapped out from every major river system west of the Mississippi. The buffalo were starting their long decline toward extinction, and European fashion, the force that had shaped the entire industry, had moved on. Silk hats had replaced beaver felt. The gentlemen of London and Paris no longer needed pelts from men who froze their fingers off in Rocky Mountain streams. But fashion hadn't abandoned fur entirely. Luxury wolf pelts, the silver grays from the northern territories, the blacks from the high country, still commanded premium prices from wealthy buyers who wanted coats and trim that spoke of wilderness and expense. The problem was supply. Or more accurately, the problem was that most trappers couldn't deliver quality that matched what the market demanded. Wolf pelts were notoriously difficult to preserve. The guard hairs that gave wolf fur its distinctive appearance were longer and coarser than beaver underfur. They broke easily during skinning. They matted when the hide wasn't properly dried. They fell out if the tanning process was rushed or done wrong. And they turned brittle and ugly if the pelt was stored incorrectly. A trapper could kill a perfect specimen of wolf, prime winter coat, thick and full, and still end up with a pelt that looked like it had been dragged behind a horse for 20 miles. But before you could ruin a pelt through poor preservation, you had to catch the wolf. And that was where most trappers failed before they even got to the skinning knife. Pierre had learned this the hard way during his first winter targeting wolves specifically. It was 1839, 2 years before his triumph at the St. Louis market, and 4 years before Singing Bird would teach him the preservation techniques that changed everything. He was working territory west of Fort Edmonton, and he'd decided that wolves represented his best chance at making decent money now that beaver were scarce. He'd been trapping for 6 years by then. He knew how to read animal sign, how to place traps, how to move through the wilderness without leaving obvious traces. He'd trapped beaver, muskrat, mink, fox, and even a few lynx. Wolves, he figured, couldn't be that much harder. He was catastrophically wrong. His first attempt at wolf trapping happened in early November, when the first serious cold had settled over the territory. Pierre had found wolf sign along a creek, tracks in the mud, scat on a prominent rock, scratch marks on a tree trunk where a wolf had marked its territory. The pack was using this creek as part of their regular hunting route. All Pierre had to do was set traps in the right spots and wait. He placed his first trap at a natural pinch point where the creek narrowed and wolves would have to pass close to the bank. He used a standard leg hold trap, the same kind he'd used successfully for beaver and fox. He covered it carefully with leaves and dirt, rubbed wolf urine on the surrounding area to mask his scent, and placed a bait, a chunk of deer meat, just beyond the trap where a wolf would have to step on the trap pan to reach it. It was, by all the standards he knew, a good set. He checked it the next morning with optimism. The trap was sprung, but empty. The bait was gone. And in the disturbed earth around the trap, Pierre could read exactly what had happened. The wolf had approached from the side, not straight on. It had circled the trap carefully, testing from multiple angles. Then it had reached in with one paw, triggered the trap deliberately, and once the jaws had closed on empty air, calmly walked in and taken the bait. The wolf had played him like a fiddle. Pierre reset the trap, trying a different approach. This time he set it with no bait at all, just placing it in the trail where wolves would naturally step. He used more care in covering it, making the disturbance of the earth less obvious. He approached and left the site from downwind, minimizing his scent trail. 2 days later, the trap was still set, but the wolf tracks in the soft earth showed the pack had walked around it. They'd known exactly where it was and had given it a wide berth. Third attempt. Pierre tried multiple traps at once, creating a gauntlet where wolves would have difficulty avoiding all of them. He spent an entire day on the setup, using every trick he knew. That night, a winter storm rolled through. By morning, snow had buried the traps completely, and the wolves had moved to different territory. It took Pierre 3 weeks and 11 failed sets before he caught his first wolf. The success came not from superior technique, but from luck. A young wolf, probably in its first winter, that hadn't yet learned the deep suspicion of traps that older wolves possessed. The young wolf stepped on a trap that the older, smarter members of its pack had avoided. Even then, Pierre nearly lost his catch. The wolf was still alive when he found it the next morning, caught by the front right paw but otherwise unhurt. And a trapped wolf is perhaps the most dangerous animal a trapper can face. Pierre approached carefully, rifle ready. The wolf watched him with yellow eyes that held more intelligence than most domestic dogs would ever possess. It didn't snarl or struggle pointlessly. It just watched, calculating, waiting for an opportunity. Pierre needed to get close enough for a clean shot, head or heart, nothing that would damage the pelt. But the wolf's chain gave it a radius of about 5 feet of movement. If Pierre got within that radius and the shot wasn't immediately fatal, the wolf would have him. He'd heard stories of trapped wolves. One trapper Pierre knew had approached what he thought was a dead wolf, only to have it lunge and tear open his thigh. The man had bled out before his partner could get him back to their cabin. Another trapper had lost 3 fingers to a wolf that played dead until he was close enough to grab. Pierre circled the trapped wolf, looking for the right angle. The wolf turned with him, always facing him, never giving him the clean shot he needed. They stood like that for nearly 20 minutes, man and wolf, locked in a deadly patience game. Finally, the wolf made a mistake. It turned its head to track a raven that had landed nearby, drawn by the scent of blood from the wolf's trapped paw. Pierre fired. The shot took the wolf just behind the ear. It dropped instantly, dead before it could even feel the bullet. Pierre's hands were shaking as he approached the body. Not from fear, though he'd been terrified, but from adrenaline and the weight of knowing he'd just killed something that had been trying desperately to survive. He'd trapped hundreds of beaver. Their deaths had never bothered him much. But this wolf, with its intelligence and its desperate will to live, felt different. He'd skinned it quickly, before his nerve failed, or before other predators showed up, drawn by the smell of blood. The pelt was decent, thick winter coat, no obvious damage from the trap or the bullet. He'd processed it using standard techniques, and it sold at Fort Edmonton for 65 cents. 65 cents for 3 weeks of work, multiple failed sets, constant vigilance, and a moment of genuine danger that could have killed him if the shot had missed. The economics were terrible. But Pierre had learned something more valuable than money. Wolves were far more intelligent than any animal he'd trapped before. They learned, they adapted, they communicated with each other. Trap one wolf, and the rest of the pack would avoid your sets for months. That first winter, Pierre caught 4 wolves. It took him from November through February to get those 4, and only one of the pelts sold for more than 50 cents. The others had damage, broken guard hairs, poor preservation, mistakes in skinning. But he was learning the behavior patterns that would later prove crucial. Wolves, he discovered, were territorial, but not stationary. They followed game herds through their territory, which meant their travel patterns shifted with the seasons and with prey availability. A trap set in a good location this week might be in a useless location next week if the elk herd moved. They were also social learners. If one wolf in a pack encountered a trap and avoided it, that wolf would teach the others. Pierre watched this happen. He'd set a line of traps along a creek, and for the first few days, the wolves avoided them all. Then he saw tracks that showed a single wolf had approached one trap very carefully, circled it completely, and left without triggering it. After that, the entire pack avoided that section of creek. The single wolf's caution had been communicated to the group. Most devastating to trappers was that wolves could distinguish between humans and other animals with uncanny accuracy. Pierre once watched from a hidden position as a wolf pack investigated one of his trap sets. They approached cautiously, sniffing carefully, and then simply avoided the area where Pierre's scent was present, even though he'd taken every precaution to minimize scent contamination. They seemed to smell not just his body odor, but the metal of his traps, the foreign substances he'd used to try to mask scents, even the disruption he'd caused to the natural arrangement of vegetation and soil. The wolves that were easiest to trap were the young, inexperienced animals and the old, desperate ones. The prime adults in their peak years were nearly impossible to catch unless you devoted weeks to studying their patterns and setting up elaborate trap arrays that anticipated their caution. This knowledge came from failure more than success. By the end of that first wolf-focused winter, Pierre had set perhaps 80 trap sets and caught 4 wolves, a 5% success rate. The work was exhausting, often dangerous, and barely profitable. Most trappers would have given up and gone back to easier prey, but Pierre was stubborn. And he was also starting to realize something important. The trappers who succeeded at wolf weren't necessarily the best trappers in the traditional sense. They were the most patient observers, the ones who could spend hours or days watching wolf behavior before setting a single trap. the ones who understood that trapping wolves was less about mechanical skill and more about psychology. The winter of 1840 and 41, the winter before his famous St. Louis sale, Pierre decided to try a different approach. Instead of setting many traps, hoping for random success, he would study a single pack intensively and design his trap sets specifically for those individual wolves' behaviors. He found a pack denning in a canyon system about 15 miles from Fort Edmonton. 7 wolves, 2 adults, 3 juveniles, and 2 yearlings. Pierre spent 2 weeks doing nothing but observing them. He watched from concealed positions, tracked their kills, mapped their travel routes, identified which pack members were more cautious and which were more aggressive. The alpha female, identifiable by her larger size and confident movements, was extraordinarily cautious. She approached every uncertain situation from downwind, circled anything interesting multiple times, and never committed to action until she'd thoroughly investigated. Trapping her directly would be nearly impossible. But the alpha male was different. He was bold, territorial, and reactive. When Pierre deliberately left scent markers, urine from a different wolf pack, in the territory, the alpha male would investigate aggressively, marking over the foreign scent with his own, asserting dominance. This gave Pierre an idea. He set a trap not in a travel route, but at a scent marking post the alpha male regularly used, a prominent boulder where the wolf would urinate to mark territory. Pierre didn't try to hide the trap. Instead, he set it openly and then added a strong scent marker that would enrage the alpha's territorial instincts. Urine from a male wolf mixed with glandular secretions that signaled dominance. The trap was calculated to exploit the wolf's psychology rather than its travel patterns. Pierre was betting that territorial rage would override caution. 2 days later, he found the alpha male caught by the right front paw. The wolf had approached the scent marker, been driven to fury by the territorial challenge, and stepped directly onto the trap in his haste to mark over the offensive scent. Pierre dispatched the wolf quickly and efficiently, but he felt no triumph. He'd won the battle of wits, yes, but only by understanding the wolf's emotional weakness and exploiting it. The wolf had been intelligent and magnificent, and now it was dead because Pierre was slightly more clever and had opposable thumbs to build traps. This wolf's pelt was perfect, prime winter coat, undamaged by the trap or the shot. Pierre skinned it carefully and processed it using standard techniques. It sold for 90 cents, the highest price he'd received for a wolf pelt. But 90 cents wasn't enough. Not for the time invested, not for the skill required, not for the intelligence of the animal he'd killed. Pierre knew that the pelt's quality was good, but he also knew it could be better. The guard hairs, while intact, had lost some of their luster during processing. The leather, while serviceable, was stiffer than it should be. Something in the preservation process was degrading the pelt's quality. He asked other trappers. Most just shrugged. That was as good as wolf pelts got, they said. The few who claimed to get better results couldn't explain their techniques clearly, or had tips that didn't work when Pierre tried them. He spent the next several months experimenting, trying different scraping methods, different drying techniques, different ways of treating the leather. Nothing worked. His pelts remained decent, but not exceptional. The gap between what he was producing and what he knew was possible frustrated him deeply. That's when fate intervened, in the form of a winter storm and a freezing river. The day Pierre stumbled half-frozen into Singing Bird's camp, he was carrying 2 wolf pelts he'd trapped the previous week. They were processed using his best techniques, and they were mediocre. Broken guard hairs, leather that was already starting to stiffen. Singing Bird had looked at those pelts during Pierre's first day in the camp. She'd examined them carefully, running her fingers over the fur and the leather. Then she'd shaken her head, not in judgment, but in something that looked like mild disappointment. These pelts represented wasted potential. A good wolf had died, but its fur wasn't being honored properly. Over the next 4 days, while Pierre recovered from his near death in the storm, Singing Bird taught him why his pelts were failing. It wasn't any single major error. It was 100 small mistakes accumulated across the entire preservation process, each one degrading quality slightly until the final product was far below what it should have been. When Pierre finally left that Cree camp and returned to his trapping territory, he had theoretical knowledge of better techniques. But having knowledge and applying it successfully were different things entirely, especially when the application required precision under brutal conditions. His first attempt after learning from Singing Bird was a disaster. Pierre trapped a young female wolf in February, killed it cleanly, and tried to apply everything he'd learned. But he miscalculated the timing. He let the carcass rest too long before skinning, and by the time he started the process, the hide had begun to stiffen in ways that made clean separation impossible. He forced it, gouged the hide in 3 places, and ended up with a pelt that sold for 40 cents. His second attempt was better, but still far from perfect. The skinning went well, but during the scraping process, Pierre removed too much tissue in some areas and not enough in others. The brain tanning mixture he prepared was too thick, and it didn't penetrate the hide evenly. The result was leather that was supple in some spots and stiff in others. The pelt sold for 75 cents. An improvement, but not the breakthrough he was hoping for. By his 5th attempt, several months after leaving Singing Bird's camp, Pierre was starting to get it right. The timing was better. The scraping was more even. The brain mixture had the right consistency. The smoking process went smoothly. The pelt came out well. Not perfect, but definitely approaching the quality he'd seen in Singing Bird's work. It sold for $1.50. That sale changed everything. $1.50 was real money for a wolf pelt. It meant the time invested in proper preservation was justified economically. It meant Pierre could make an actual living from wolf trapping if he could replicate this quality consistently. But replicating quality required more than just technique. It required catching wolves reliably, which meant Pierre needed to get much better at trapping them. He couldn't afford to spend 3 weeks per wolf anymore. He needed to increase his success rate while maintaining the observation and patience that made trapping wolves possible. The winter of 1840 to 41 was when Pierre put it all together. He mapped multiple territories, studying several different packs simultaneously. He kept detailed notes on each pack's behavior, identifying the vulnerable members, the young, the aggressive, the ones whose patterns were most predictable. He set fewer traps, but placed them with far more strategic thought, often spending days observing before committing to a set. His success rate jumped from 5% to nearly 30%. Out of 50 carefully planned trap sets, he caught 14 wolves. And because he was taking more time with preservation, 12 of those 14 pelts came out at premium quality. That was the winter that produced the 23 perfect pelts he brought to St. Louis in spring 1841. 23 wolves caught through superior observation and strategy. 23 pelts processed using techniques he'd learned from Singing Bird and then refined through repeated practice. When Marcus Brennan offered $3 per pelt, he was paying for more than just the physical object. He was paying for Pierre's hard-won knowledge of wolf behavior, his understanding of their psychology, his patience in observation, his skill in exploitation of their patterns, and his technical mastery of preservation techniques that turned a good pelt into an exceptional one. The other trappers gathered around Pierre's table that morning in St. Louis understood they were seeing something remarkable, not just in the pelts themselves, but in what those pelts represented. Proof that wolves could be trapped successfully and consistently if you were willing to invest the time and mental energy to understand them. After Marcus Brennan counted out $69 in gold and silver coin, after Pierre had secured the money in his leather pouch, James Coulter leaned in close and asked the question that really mattered. How do you catch them? Not, how do you preserve the pelts? I saw those look perfect. How do you get the wolves in the first place? Because I've been trapping 5 years, and I can barely catch one wolf in 10 tries. Pierre glanced around the circle of faces. These men needed to understand that technique in preservation meant nothing if you couldn't catch wolves to begin with. Patience, he said, and understanding that wolves are smarter than you. Once you accept that they're smarter, you stop trying to outthink them and start trying to understand them instead. That's philosophy, not instruction, Samuel Potts said. We need practical advice. Pierre nodded. All right, practical advice. Stop setting traps in obvious places. Wolves know what obvious looks like, and they avoid it. Stop using bait that's too fresh or too rotten. Wolves are suspicious of both. Stop checking your traps every day because your repeated scent trail tells them exactly where the danger is. And most importantly, stop trying to trap the alpha wolves. They're too smart. Target the younger animals, the ones that haven't learned full caution yet, or the old ones that are desperate enough to take risks. That's it? Coulter asked. That's the basics. The real skill comes from observation. You need to watch the pack you're targeting, learn their patterns, identify individuals, understand their territory and how they move through it. A trap set without understanding the specific wolves you're after is just gambling. A trap set with knowledge is hunting. Henri Marchand spoke up. How long do you observe before setting traps? Depends. Sometimes a few days if I'm familiar with the territory and the wolf behavior is straightforward. Sometimes 2 weeks if I'm working a new area or a particularly cautious pack. The time invested in observation pays off in success rate. I'd rather spend a week watching and catch 3 wolves from 5 sets than spend no time observing and catch 1 wolf from 20 sets. Thomas Bridger, who'd been listening quietly, finally asked the question Pierre had been waiting for. What's your Actual success rate? Sets versus catches? This past winter, 32%. 56 trap sets, 18 wolves caught. 12 of those 18 pelts came out premium quality. The other 6 had various problems. 1 got damaged by a wolverine before I could retrieve it. 2 I messed up during skinning when I was tired. 3 didn't take the brain tanning properly because the winter was so cold I couldn't keep the temperature right. 32%. The trappers did the math in their heads. That was 6 times better than most of them managed. 6 times more wolves caught from the same amount of effort in setting traps. Combined with the premium prices Pierre's pelts commanded, he was probably making 10 to 15 times more money per wolf than the average trapper. "Rousseau's Tavern," Pierre said. "Tomorrow night. I'll show you what I can. But understand, the trapping technique is harder to teach than the preservation technique. Preservation is mechanical. You follow steps, you practice, you improve. Trapping requires judgment that comes from experience. I can tell you what to look for, but you'll need to develop the feel for it through trial and error." The next night's meeting at Rousseau's Tavern focused on preservation techniques as described earlier. But the teaching expedition that followed a few days later, that's where the real education happened. Because watching someone demonstrate wolf trapping in ideal conditions was different from actually doing it in the field, where everything could go wrong. They rode north from St. Louis into good wolf country, rolling hills where oak and hickory gave way to open meadows. Samuel Potts found wolf sign within hours of making camp. Fresh tracks, recent scat, scratch marks on trees. The pack was close. "First step," Pierre said, gathering the group, "is observation before action. We found sign, but we don't set traps yet. We need to understand where this pack is going, not just where they've been." For the next day and a half, Pierre led them in tracking exercises. They followed the wolf pack's movements, noting patterns. The wolves were hunting deer. There was a small herd in the area, maybe 15 animals, and the wolf pack, probably 6 or 7 individuals based on the track patterns, was working them systematically. "See this?" Pierre pointed to a cluster of tracks where multiple wolves had stopped and appeared to mill around. "This is a planning point. The pack stopped here, probably to coordinate. See how the tracks scatter from here in different directions? They split up to attempt to surround." "They plan hunts?" one of the younger trappers asked, sounding skeptical. "Absolutely. Wolves are cooperative hunters. They communicate, they strategize, they use tactics that require coordination. If you think of them as just dumb animals following instinct, you'll never catch them." They followed the tracks to a kill site, a yearling deer that the wolves had brought down 2 days earlier. The carcass was mostly consumed, but bones and hide remained, along with clear evidence of multiple wolves feeding. Pierre examined the site carefully. "Count the distinct tracks. Each wolf has slightly different feet, size, shape, pattern of wear on the pads. You can identify individuals if you learn to read the subtle differences." He pointed out 4 distinct wolves from the tracks around the kill site. One was significantly larger than the others, probably the alpha male. Another left tracks that showed a slight limp in the left rear leg. An old injury maybe, or just the beginning of joint problems. A third had unusually small feet for a wolf, possibly a juvenile or a naturally small adult. "The injured one," Pierre said, tapping the tracks that showed the limp. "That's your target. The injury makes it less mobile, which means it takes more risks. It can't chase prey as effectively, so it's more likely to be hungry. Hungry wolves are less cautious wolves." They spent another day observing before Pierre was ready to set traps. He chose 3 locations, each one carefully calculated based on the pack's movement patterns. No bait, no obvious visual indicators. Just traps placed precisely where the injured wolf would likely step based on its limited mobility and the pack's established routes. "Why no bait?" Coulter asked. "Because bait attracts attention," Pierre explained. "These wolves have seen bait before. They associate it with danger. But a trap set in a natural travel path with nothing suspicious around it, that's something they might not notice until it's too late." The traps were set with meticulous care. Pierre demonstrated how to dig the depression for the trap pan so it sat slightly below ground level, how to cover it with thin fabric that would collapse under a wolf's weight but not trigger the trap prematurely, how to scatter dirt and leaves so the disturbance looked natural rather than recently dug. Most importantly, he showed them how to approach and leave the trap site in ways that minimized scent trail and visual disturbance. You walk in from one direction, set the trap, and leave from a different direction. Never use the same path twice. Wolves notice repeated human trails, and they avoid them. The group retreated to a distance where they could observe without interfering. Then they waited. 1 day, 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Vaughn spotted vultures circling about a mile from their camp. "That's not our trap," Pierre said immediately. "Wrong direction, wrong distance, but it means something died. Could be natural. Could be the wolf pack made a kill. Let's check." They approached carefully and found a young elk that had died from what looked like a broken leg. Probably fell, snapped the bone, and couldn't get up. The carcass was fresh enough that scavengers were just beginning to find it, and in the mud around the body were wolf tracks. Pierre studied the scene intently. "The pack found this. They fed on it overnight, and look." He pointed to a set of tracks that showed the distinctive limp pattern. "Our target wolf was here." This changed the strategy. A free meal meant the wolves wouldn't need to hunt aggressively for several days. They'd be satiated, less mobile, more relaxed in their patterns. That made them simultaneously more catchable because they'd be less alert, and harder to catch because they had less reason to travel the routes where Pierre had set traps. "Adaptation," Pierre said to the watching trappers. "This is what I meant about judgment. The situation changed. We can either wait for the wolves to digest and return to their normal patterns, or we can adjust our trap placement to account for their current behavior." He decided to adjust. They pulled one of the existing traps and relocated it to a path that led from the elk carcass back toward what Pierre believed was the pack's den area. Wolves would return to safe territory after feeding. This new location was a calculated guess about where that safe territory might be. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and long shadows stretched across the hills, they heard it. The sharp, metallic snap of a trap closing. The sound carried clearly in the cold air. Somewhere out there, something had triggered one of their sets. They waited until full dark before approaching, giving the trapped animal time to exhaust itself struggling if it was going to struggle. Pierre led, rifle ready, moving slowly and carefully. The others followed with torches that they kept shuttered until needed. The trap held a wolf. Not the injured one they'd been targeting, but a younger animal, probably a 2-year-old based on its size. It had been caught cleanly by the right front paw and had apparently struggled hard initially. The ground around the trap was torn up, and the wolf was bleeding from its caught leg. Now, though, it had stopped fighting. It sat watching them approach, yellow eyes reflecting the shuttered torchlight. Pierre could see the intelligence there, the awareness. The wolf knew it was in terrible danger. It was calculating its chances. "This is the dangerous part," Pierre said quietly to the others. "Trapped wolves are deadly. They don't panic. They wait for opportunity. I've known men who thought a quiet wolf was a safe wolf and found out otherwise when they got too close." He approached from an angle that kept him outside the wolf's chain radius while giving him a clear shot at the head. The wolf watched him, tracking his movement with precision. When Pierre raised the rifle, the wolf didn't flinch. It just watched. Pierre fired. The shot took the wolf cleanly through the temple. It dropped instantly, dead before the sound of the gunshot had finished echoing across the hills. In the stillness that followed, Henri Marchande spoke softly. "That's the third time I've watched something die on this trip. The deer, the pack, killed. The elk with the broken leg, now this wolf. And I've been thinking, we're out here taking lives for profit. That feels like it should bother me more than it does." "It should bother you enough that you do it respectfully," Pierre said. "And it should bother you enough that you don't waste what you take. This wolf died. That's a fact. The only thing we control now is whether its death serves a purpose or was pointless." They hauled the wolf back to camp. Pierre had brought the wolf carcass specifically so he could demonstrate the complete preservation process from a fresh kill, not a demonstration on a pelt that had already been partially processed. "Before we start," Pierre said, "there's something you need to understand. This animal gave its life for our profit. That deserves respect, which means we don't waste any part of it, and we process it with the care it deserves. If you're going to kill wolves for a living, the least you can do is make sure their death serves a purpose beyond just putting coins in your pocket." The demonstration that followed covered everything: the hour-long waiting period, the careful skinning that followed the connective tissue patterns, the meticulous scraping that Pierre narrated with every stroke, the brain tanning preparation and application, the smoking process that took hours of careful monitoring. But what stuck with the watching trappers wasn't just the technical skill. It was watching Pierre work with something that looked almost like reverence. Every cut was deliberate. Every motion was considered. He was taking something dead and transforming it into something valuable, but he was doing it in a way that honored what the animal had been in life. By the time the pelt was finished, supple leather, perfect guard hairs, the rich smell of wood smoke, and properly tanned hide, the trappers understood that they weren't just learning a technique. They were learning an ethic. Knowledge without responsibility was just exploitation, but knowledge applied with care and respect, that was craftsmanship. Over the next 2 days, they caught and processed 2 more wolves. Each time, Pierre stepped back and let the trappers do more of the work themselves. Coulter caught the second wolf, the injured one they'd originally targeted. Bridger caught the third, a young female that had investigated one of the trap sets with insufficient caution. Each time, the trappers worked through the complete process under Pierre's supervision: skinning, scraping, brain tanning, smoking. Each time they made mistakes and learned from them. Each time the final product was better than their previous attempts. By the time they broke camp and rode back toward St. Louis, the education was complete. They understood both halves of what Pierre had mastered: the patience and observation required to catch wolves consistently, and the technical skill and care required to preserve their pelts at premium quality. Coulter rode alongside Pierre as they neared the city. "That wolf I caught," he said, "the injured one. I watched it for 2 days before I set that trap. Studied its movement, identified its patterns, placed the trap exactly where I calculated it would step. When it worked, when I heard that trap snap, I felt something I haven't felt in years of trapping. Pride. Not just that I caught it, but that I'd earned it through understanding. That's the difference, Pierre said, between harvesting and hunting. Harvesting is taking what's available. Hunting is earning your take through skill and understanding. Wolves force you to hunt. You can't just harvest them. They won't allow it. The Cree woman who taught you the preservation techniques, Coulter continued, did she teach you the trapping too? Some. Her people have been hunting wolves for longer than anyone can count. They understand wolf behavior in ways that white trappers are just starting to figure out. But the observation techniques I use, those came mostly from trial and error, from failing enough times that I eventually learned what worked. Failure is expensive. Very, but less expensive than never learning at all. They reached St. Louis in the early afternoon. The city was as chaotic as ever, but something had changed in the week they'd been gone. Word of Pierre's premium pelts had spread further. More trappers were asking questions about techniques. A few traders were specifically seeking out properly preserved wolf pelts, willing to pay premiums for quality they hadn't seen before. Pierre sold Coulter's pelt, the one from the injured wolf, for $2.75. It wasn't quite the $3 premium Pierre's own pelts commanded, but it was far above the standard rate. Coulter stood there looking at the coins in his hand, and Pierre saw tears in the man's eyes. That's 9 months of supplies, Coulter said quietly, from one pelt. One pelt done right instead of 3 done poorly. And you'll get better, Pierre assured him. Your 10th pelt will be better than your first. Your 100th better still. The technique becomes automatic with practice. Eventually, you won't even think about it. Your hands will just know what to do. The knowledge spread from that point like ripples in water. Coulter taught 2 other trappers what he'd learned. Bridger taught 3 more. Marchand returned to his French-Canadian community and shared the techniques there. By the winter of 1841-42, perhaps 30 trappers across the Missouri and Upper Mississippi territories were applying some version of Pierre's methods. Not all of them succeeded. Some couldn't develop the patience for proper wolf observation. Others tried to shortcut the preservation process and ended up with inferior pelts. A few gave up after their first failures, deciding the technique was too demanding or too time-consuming. But those who stuck with it, who invested the time in learning both wolf behavior and preservation technique, found their incomes improving dramatically. Men who'd been barely surviving began making enough to support families. Young trappers entering the trade found that starting with proper techniques from the beginning gave them advantages that older trappers had never developed. The economic impact rippled through frontier communities. Families that had been considering giving up the trapping life found they could continue. Small frontier towns that depended on trappers' seasonal income saw those incomes stabilize. The fur trade was still declining overall, but individual trappers who adapted could succeed even in a contracting market. Pierre found himself in an unusual position. He was somewhat famous within the trapping community, but not substantially wealthier than before. As more trappers mastered the technique, the premium prices for quality pelts declined. He was still doing well, but the enormous advantage he'd held in 1841 had eroded as others learned what he knew. He didn't particularly mind. The point had never been to maintain a monopoly on knowledge. The point was to survive in a dying trade by producing quality goods and to help others do the same. If that meant sharing advantages until they weren't advantages anymore, so be it. By 1843, 2 years after his demonstration at the St. Louis Fur Market, the landscape of wolf trapping had genuinely changed. Premium pelts were no longer rare exceptions. They were expected from competent trappers. The baseline quality had risen, and with it, the expectations. Traders like Marcus Brennan adjusted their pricing structures. They couldn't pay $3 for pelts that were now commonly available, but they could pay consistently higher prices than they'd offered for the inferior products that had been standard before. The wolf populations were starting to show strain under the increased pressure. Better trapping techniques meant more wolves caught. Higher prices meant more trappers targeting wolves. By 1844, wolves were noticeably scarcer in territories that had previously supported healthy populations. Pierre saw the pattern, and it worried him. He'd lived through the beaver collapse. He'd watched a seemingly inexhaustible resource vanish in less than 2 decades of intensive exploitation. Now he was watching the same thing happen with wolves, and he knew that part of the responsibility lay with him. By teaching better trapping techniques, he'd enabled more efficient exploitation of a resource that couldn't sustain that level of harvest. Some trappers responded by pushing into new territories, seeking undisturbed wolf populations. Others began talking about sustainable practices, limiting harvest, rotating trapping areas, leaving breeding pairs alone. These conversations happened around campfires and in trading posts, men who'd spent their lives taking from the land, starting to wonder if maybe there should be limits. The Cree managed it, Pierre told Thomas Bridger during one such conversation in the winter of 1844. They hunted wolves for generations without wiping them out. There must be a way to take enough to live on without taking so much that the population crashes. The Cree also weren't supplying European fashion markets, Bridger pointed out. They were taking maybe 20, 30 wolves per year across a huge territory. We're taking hundreds, maybe thousands across all the trappers working wolf now. The math doesn't work. It was a stark truth. Indigenous hunting practices had developed in the context of small populations taking limited amounts for subsistence. The fur trade operated on an entirely different scale, industrial exploitation, driven by distant market demands. Maybe wolf goes the way of beaver, Marchande said glumly during that same conversation. Another decade, and we're all looking for something else to trap. Or maybe, Bridger suggested, we get smarter about how much we take, set limits, rotate territories, focus on old males past breeding age, and leave the females and young alone. It won't be popular with men who need every pelt they can get, but it's better than trapping out the resource completely. The conversations continued, but translating talk into action proved difficult. How do you convince hundreds of independent trappers to voluntarily limit their harvest when their family's survival depends on their income? How do you enforce sustainable practices in territories with no effective government? Pierre didn't have answers, but he kept trying to find them, kept talking about responsibility along with technique, kept crediting Singing Bird and her people's sustainable practices whenever he taught new trappers. The winter of 1845 to 46 brought the changes everyone had been predicting. Fashion was genuinely moving away from fur. The premium prices that had made quality wolf trapping profitable were eroding. When Pierre brought his pelts to St. Louis that spring, Brennan offered $1.50 per pelt, half what he'd paid just 3 years earlier. "Market's changing," Brennan said, apologetic but firm. "The wealthy buyers aren't interested anymore. I can still move quality pelts, but at lower prices. I'm sorry, Pierre. I know what your work is worth, but I can only pay what the market will bear." Pierre took the money without complaint. He'd known this was coming. The fur trade was dying, and no amount of technical skill could change that fundamental reality. That summer, Pierre made his journey to find Singing Bird. When he found her camp and spent those days learning additional techniques, she asked him a question that had been weighing on her mind. "The wolves, are there fewer now where you trap?" Pierre answered honestly, "Yes, significantly fewer. The techniques you taught me allowed more trappers to catch wolves successfully. That increased harvest pressure. I'm partly responsible for the decline." Singing Bird was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her grandson translated. "Knowledge is a tool. Tools can build or destroy. When you teach, you must teach wisdom along with technique. Otherwise, you're just creating more efficient destruction." It was a rebuke, gently delivered but pointed. Pierre had taught technique effectively, but had he taught wisdom? Had he emphasized sustainable practices and respect for the resource as strongly as he demonstrated brain tanning and smoking methods? He couldn't honestly say he had. He'd mentioned it, but he hadn't made it central to his teaching. He'd been focused on helping struggling trappers survive economically. The longer-term consequences of more efficient wolf trapping hadn't been his priority. "I'll do better," Pierre promised. "When I teach now, I'll talk about limits, about leaving breeding pairs, about watching populations and pulling back when numbers decline." "Will they listen?" Singing Bird asked. "Some will, some won't, but at least I'll have tried." Pierre left that camp carrying both additional knowledge and additional responsibility. The techniques Singing Bird taught him that summer, the caribou hide preservation, the sinew preparation, the leather waterproofing, all came with explicit instructions about sustainable harvest. Take old animals, leave young breeding stock, move to different areas when populations show stress. Don't be greedy. When Pierre returned to his trapping territories, he started incorporating these lessons into his practice and his teaching. He took fewer wolves himself, focusing on old males that were past prime breeding age. He refused to teach trappers who he suspected would be purely exploitative. He began talking about sustainable practices in the same detail he'd once used to describe brain tanning technique. Some trappers appreciated this. Others thought he'd gone soft, or that he was trying to limit competition by convincing others to self-restrict. But Pierre kept at it, because Singing Bird had been right. Knowledge without wisdom was just a more efficient path to destruction. The winter of 1846-47 was brutal, and it killed the remnants of Pierre's trapping career. He barely survived the season. His catch was minimal. His body was breaking down from years of hard living in harsh conditions. When spring came, he knew he was done. His last trip to St. Louis in spring 1847 felt like closing a book. He sold his final pelts to Brennan, 4 perfectly preserved wolf hides that represented everything he'd learned and everything he'd tried to be. Brennan paid him $1.25 per pelt, and they both knew this was the end. "You changed this trade," Brennan said as they settled accounts. "Maybe not permanently, but for a few years there, you showed people what was possible when you combined skill with respect. That matters." Pierre hoped he was right. He left St. Louis for the last time and headed west toward Oregon, where he'd heard frontier communities needed guides and teachers. His trapping days were over, but his knowledge was still valuable. He could teach sustainable practices, wilderness survival, leather working. He could continue Singing Bird's gift by making sure the wisdom came packaged with the technique. The fur trade continued for a few more years in diminished form, then faded to marginal status. But the techniques Pierre had learned and taught did persist. The knowledge of brain tanning, proper hide preservation, patient observation of animal behavior. These skills passed forward through generations, finding new applications in new contexts. Some of Pierre's students established tanning businesses in frontier towns. Others taught the techniques to indigenous groups facing displacement and economic disruption. A few wrote down what they'd learned, creating documentation that preserved knowledge that had previously existed only in oral tradition. The wolves recovered eventually. After decades of near extirpation in many areas, conservation efforts in the 20th century brought populations back. Modern wolf hunting is carefully regulated, with strict limits and seasonal restrictions. The idea that you need to manage harvest to ensure population sustainability, an idea that Pierre tried to teach in his later years, is now the foundation of wildlife management. The connection to Singing Bird and the Cree origins of the techniques was mostly lost over time. People remembered Pierre's name, but fewer remembered where he'd learned what he taught. This erasure was perhaps inevitable, but it remained a fundamental injustice. Knowledge developed by Native Americans over centuries became credited to white trappers who'd merely learned to replicate it. Pierre himself would have hated that. He'd tried to credit Singing Bird honestly whenever he taught. But historical memory is selective, and frontier stories tend to emphasize white protagonists over indigenous teachers. What remains is the knowledge itself, the techniques for properly working with leather and fur, the understanding that animals deserve respect and sustainable harvest, the wisdom that efficiency without sustainability is just a faster path to collapse. These lessons, learned through hard experience by indigenous peoples and relearned painfully by frontier trappers, remain relevant today. Pierre Dubois' moment in St. Louis in 1841 represented a brief window when traditional indigenous knowledge was valued on its own terms by an economic system that usually ignored such knowledge. His choice to share what he'd learned openly, crediting Singing Bird explicitly, created ripples that spread that knowledge more widely and preserved it for future generations. In the end, Pierre was a bridge figure, connecting indigenous knowledge systems with white frontier economics, traditional techniques with market demands, oral traditions with written documentation. He didn't create the techniques he became known for. He didn't resolve the injustices embedded in the fur trade. But he did his best to learn with humility, teach with generosity, and credit with honesty. The perfect wolf pelts that astonished traders in 1841 St. Louis were monuments to knowledge that stretched back centuries. The fact that we remember Pierre's name, but not singing birds, that we credit the white trapper who learned the technique, but rarely mention the indigenous woman who taught it, tells us everything about whose stories survive and whose get erased. Pierre would have hated that. He tried to do better. That he couldn't fully succeed reveals the limitations of individual virtue in the face of systemic injustice, but also the importance of trying anyway. If stories like Pierre's resonate with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.